Well, hello everyone, and welcome back to Human Biology here at Chaminade University. Today we will be discussing the respiratory system, which is Module 8B. Now, the purpose of the respiratory system is to circulate oxygen to the cells and remove carbon dioxide. Basically, it serves to drop off all of the groceries and remove the trash from each of the cells. It's also going to serve to regulate your blood pH by removing the carbon dioxide from the bloodstream and off-gassing it into the lungs. This is going to help keep the pH of the blood a little bit higher because carbon dioxide in the bloodstream will lower or make acidosis, make the bloodstream a little bit more acidic. It also serves to moisten the inhaled air and to warm it up so that we're able to get the temperature correct and the moisture correct. And we're going to be filtering particles out from the air that we inhale as well. And last but not least, it's going to allow us to have the sensation of smell and the creation of sound by pushing air past the vocal cords and making particular structures with our tongue and lips. So these are just some definitions that you need to know when we're talking about respiration. So ventilation is when air is moving into and out of the lungs. This is why we use a ventilator when we artificially respirate for a patient. Inspiration is breathing in. Expiration is breathing out. And the actual act of gas exchange, which occurs in the lungs, is called respiration. And in the cells, we're going to be utilizing we're going to be utilizing glucose, which is going to be broken down into carbon dioxide, and that's going to generate ATP and also generate what we call cellular waste, right? Carbon dioxide that has to be off gas. So we'll be utilizing oxygen to break down that glucose, and our end product there will be ATP. Now, this graph here depicts the lung volume of when you inhale and exhale. So your tidal volume, which you're normally inspiring and expiring, is somewhere between 500 to 750 cc's. So during a normal breath, you're only exchanging about 750 of your total 3,000. Now, if you were to take a full inhale, so this would be the deepest inhale that you could possibly take, that's the inspiratory capacity, which would be the inspiratory capacity is from the exhale, your normal exhale, to your full inspiration, okay? That's going to get us up to about 6,000. So we can actually exchange several more liters with a full inhale and exhale than we would with our normal breathing. Again, that's going to be tidal volume. Okay, our full expiration here is going to get us down to that part here, right? That's the vital capacity is going to be the difference between the full expiration and the full inspiration. Note that we don't exhale that last 1,000 or so. That's the residual volume. Why not? Because if we did exhale it, we wouldn't have the strength to be able to re-inhale. So we need to have a little bit there to be able to give it the residual volume to be able to allow the inspiration to occur. All right, some other things of interest. So again, full inspiration to full expiration, that's vital capacity. From your normal expiration to the full inspiration, that's called inspiratory capacity. The expiratory reserve volume is the amount that from a normal exhale to your full exhalation. So a normal exhale is only going to get you down to about 2,500, and a full exhale will take you down to around 12. All right, so your total lung capacity is going to be the full volume of your lungs, but you never actually utilize all of that because of this residual volume here. Okay, so again, full inspiration is going to get you up to about 6 liters, full expiration down to about 1,200. So we really can take in about 38 or so, 3,800 or so in our full inspiration, but we're typically only going to be exchanging about 500 or so. Okay, let's talk about the anatomy of the respiratory system. So air is going to go in through the nose and hit the nasal cavity. It can also go in through the mouth. Either way, it's going to enter into the pharynx, which is the funnel at the back of the throat. Then it goes through the larynx, which is where you're going to have your voice box and your true and false vocal folds. You're going to have the trachea, which is the lung that's going to take you, the tube that's going to take you into the lungs. Apologies. And then that trachea is going to split into the bronchi. We have a left and a right bronchi, which are going to feed to the left and right lungs. And as we travel down the lungs, we're eventually going to get into alveoli, which have alveolar sacs at the bottom, which are the actual site of inspiration. So we divide the structures up into whether they are going to be actually exchanging gas, like the alveolar sacs or in the respiratory zone, or are they just conducting the air in and out? Are they just a pipe, right? Like the trachea is just a wind pipe. So the air is just coming in and out of the trachea, but it's not actually performing gas exchange like the alveolar sacs. Now again, the trachea, or the windpipe, has 3 major layers. And then we also have the mucosal layer that has goblet cells and cilia. Now, smoking obviously is bad for you for many reasons, but one way that it can be bad for you is by killing off the cilia inside these cells, which then means that the mucus is unable to what we call expectorate or leave the lungs on its own, which means that the only way to get rid of the mucus is a continuous cough, right? We call that like a smoker's cough. And again, it's just going to basically take the place of what the cilia were doing previously in removing the sputum from the lungs. Okay, so again, we're going to inspire through the nose and over the mouth, and we're going to head back toward the pharynx. The pharynx is this funnel towards the back. The pharynx is going to then head into the larynx, which is where we're going to have the vocal cords, and into the trachea. We also have eustachian tubes, which are depicted here. I guess they're not depicted very well. And then eustachian tubes are going to actually lead to the middle ear, so we're going to utilize these when we're equalizing air pressure. So if you've ever been scuba diving or on a plane and you've had to hold your nose to equalize your ear pressure, what you've done is pushed air through the eustachian tubes to make sure that we have equal pressure on the inside and the outside of the ear. Now, this guy here is called the epiglottis. The epiglottis is kind of a cool little creature because normally it's open, so we're going to allow air in. But when you swallow, it's going to fold down, and that's going to allow the food to go towards the back of the throat, towards the esophagus, which is the food pipe, if you will. And so that's going to allow you the process of swallowing. After you're finished swallowing, the epiglottis is going to go back up again. And in this way, you're going to be able to restore regular breathing. So for a moment there, when you're swallowing, you are completely unable to breathe. So we have the larynx here. It's called the voice box. It has vocal cords. We also have false vocal folds in here. And then the trachea is going to be this windpipe. Here we have the left and the, after we get to the bottom of the trachea, we're going to have the left and the right bronchi, which are going to actually enter the lungs and eventually become bronchioles and terminal bronchioles. These are the vocal cords. So this is an endoscopic image, basically a camera taken from being put down the throat. And the vocal cords are going to be comprised of elastic tissue that's connective and can vibrate, allowing us to make sounds. Here's the larynx from the anterior or the front and the posterior or the back. Here we have a ton of different cartilages. So we're going to have this hyoid bone here. It's the free floating bone. So it's going to be connected only by these like ligaments to other pieces of cartilage, not to other bones. Here's the thyroid ligament, which connects the thyroid cartilage and the hyoid bone. Here we have the vocal ligament, which is going to run right on through here. It's going to allow us to be able to make noise. So the cricoid cartilage and the tracheal cartilage, if you've ever seen a movie where someone's choking and someone in a restaurant takes a pen and the bottle of vodka and sterilizes the pen and then takes the ink out of the pen and then jams the tube of the pen into someone's throat to allow them to breathe, right? They've just performed a tracheotomy or a cricotomy, so you can put a hole in the cricoid, right in between the cricoid cartilage and the thyroid cartilage, or between the cricoid and the tracheal, and that way we can instate an extra wind tube, basically, in someone who has a wind blockage upstream. It's a pretty severe thing. It typically is not going to go as well as you see in the movies. There's going to be a lot of blood. There's going to be blood forming in the region that's going to be going to the throat. So it's not something you're going to want to do, but you do see it all the time in movies. All right. So here's the anatomy of the respiratory system. Right here we have, again, the larynx feeding into the trachea feeding into the bronchioles, into the left and right lungs. Surrounding these lungs, we have a region called the pleura. Okay, the pleura is this whole pleural sac here. We have two different sides of the pleural membrane that are going to have a fluid in between, so fluid interface. The visceral pleura is going to be the part that's covering the lungs or the organ itself, and the parietal pleura is going to be the part that's going to line the thoracic cavity. And the space in between the two is called the pleural cavity, and that's going to be filled with fluid, so that when you're breathing, you're going to have no frictional resistance of those organs rubbing against each other. Okay, this here is a diaphragm. It's a muscle that's going to be contracted to allow us to inspire. So when it's contracted, this is going to pull down. And that means that we're going to be having a decrease in pressure inside the lungs. So air is going to flood in. That's going to be inspiration. And then it's going to relax, pushing this upward, pushing air out of the lungs for expiration. All right, so gas exchange actually occurs in the bronchioles and the alveoli. So here's the bronchioles. And here are the alveoli. They look like a series of grapes. And each of these grapes is going to be surrounded by blood vessels. So that vasculature is going to be bringing blood that is deoxygenated. It's going to exchange the carbon dioxide that it's carrying for oxygen, become oxygenated, and then return back into the heart via the pulmonary artery. So these, again, are going to be the sites of gas exchange. So most of the surfaces are going to be lined by a particular type of cell called type 1 alveolar cells. We have type 1 and type 2 alveolar cells. Type 1 alveolar cells are going to be the cells that are going to be lining this whole area, and type 2 are going to be secreting a surfactant. That surfactant is going to assist with gas exchange, so it's going to make that liquid wetter, if that makes sense, so that we are going to make it a little bit thinner, allowing for the gas to exchange very easily right across this wall. So again, gas is going to exchange from these pulmonary capillaries across the wall here. So we're going to be having carbon dioxide going that way and oxygen going this way, right, into the gas or into the blood supply. Again, the type 2 alveolar cells make a surfactant, which is going to decrease the viscosity of water, lowering the surface tension. And that's going to make the lungs a little bit more compliant and allows them to more easily expand. It also is going to allow for more efficient gas exchange, again, carbon dioxide leaving and oxygen heading in there. Now, the total surface area of all of our alveoli is very large. In fact, if you were to lay it all out just from one person's lungs, you'd be able to cover an entire tennis court. And so this is how we're going to have a large amount of oxygen and carbon dioxide rapidly being exchanged via diffusion. All right, so here's our application question for this semester, or for this lecture. We have an athlete, Greg, who's going to train for a marathon, and he's going to be doing this at an altitude of 6,000 feet. Now, the oxygen is going to be about 16.5% there, which is a little bit lower. And we want to calculate the partial pressure of the oxygen in the training camp. So until he's been able to adapt to the higher altitude, therefore his gas exchange is going to get him more oxygen, do you think his tidal volume will change? And what will happen to his alveolar pressure at rest? Also, if we have less oxygen in the air, how is this hemoglobin saturation affected, and what kind of regulatory changes will be occurring? So we'll be answering this application question towards the end of this lecture. So just kind of keep it in mind as we move forward. All right, so let's talk about pulmonary ventilation. Pulmonary ventilation is what you think of when you think of breathing. It's the site of gas exchange in the lungs, where we're bringing in air from the outside and we're off-gassing the gases that are in our blood supply. So lungs are going to be found in the thoracic cavity. That's going to be a closed compartment that's going to be in the center of the chest. That's going to allow us to regulate the air pressure inside the lungs. Our heart's also found in that chest cavity. And the muscles that are used for breathing are going to be different for inspiration and expiration. So inspiration, or breathing in, is going to take your diaphragm and make it contract, as well as relying on the contraction of your external intercostal muscles, which is the muscles that are going to run along your rib cage. Now, expiration is going to also rely on the diaphragm, but it's going to be a relaxation event, and the intercostals are also going to relax. That's going to cause the lungs to actually kind of collapse a little bit, forcing air outward. Now, the pressure in the lungs, the intrapleural pressure, as well as the alveolar pressure, is going to decide whether or not air is moving into or out of the lungs. If we have a decreased pressure inside, air is going to be sucked in, and if we increase the pressure inside, air is going to be pushed outward. Now, when we exhale as completely as possible, so not just a normal tidal volume exhale, but a forced exhalation, which is what happens, forced inhalation and exhalation, which is what happens during exercise, right? We start getting deeper and deeper breaths. So a forced inhalation is going to cause a contraction of the sternocleidomastoids inside the neck, and you can feel it if you take a nice deep breath, it's going to contract. That's going to help pull the sternum up and the clavicles. That means your upper ribs are going to also be moving upward a little bit, increasing your thoracic cavity volume. Now, an individual who's suffering a severe asthma attack, he can end up having contraction, or she can end up having contraction of the pectoralis muscles as well. So someone who's enduring an asthma attack might sometimes be raising their shoulders to try to increase their lung volume because they're having such a hard time getting air into their lungs. Now, during forced exhalation, or like exercise or sneezing or coughing, we're also going to be using our internal intercostals and our abdominal muscles. So if you take a nice deep inhale and then exhale as hard as you can feel that actually is going to tighten down your abs. So these are the different structures involved in ventilation. So again, as we're inhaling, we're going to be tightening down the external intercostals, as well as the sternocleidomastoid, as well as pulling down and tightening that diaphragm. When we're exhaling, we're going to be tightening down the internal intercostals and relaxing the diaphragm, as well as tightening down the obliques and the rectus abdominis. So we're going to be tightening down our abdominal muscles. And then this is showing you what happens to the diaphragm. So during inhalation, it's going to get tightened down. That's going to cause the chest cavity to expand a little bit, pulling air in. And during exhalation, it's going to move upward, forcing air outward. Okay, but it's not really the contraction that forces the air in and outward. What forces the air in and outward is the change of the atmospheric pressure. So everything's relative to the atmospheric. Actually, the atmospheric pressure is always the same, but the internal pressure of the lungs is going to change relative to the atmospheric pressure. So we're going to measure it in milligrams of mercury. And normally we're going to be about 760 milligrams or 1 atm. And if we go up higher, the pressure is going to be a little bit lower, so you end up with a little bit less gas available for exchange. Now, here at rest, the atmospheric pressure is about 1, and the interpleural space is about 0.994, so they're about the same, right? During exhalation, we're going to force the diaphragm upward, which is going to cause an increase in the pressure inside the lungs, okay? So the interpleural pressure is actually going to go above 1 atm, right? The alveolar pressure is 1.03, and it actually means that we're going to be pushing that gas back outward, okay, if that makes sense. So that gas is going to then be pushing outward. Here, when we have inhalation, our alveolar pressure is going to be lower, and our interpleural pressure is going to be lower than the atmospheric pressure, so air is going to be going inward. All right, so interpleural pressure, which is the pressure in between the lungs and the pleural space, is going to fluctuate with breathing, but it's always going to be a little bit less than alveolar pressure. And the reason that is because if it were ever equal, there'd be no force to hold the alveoli open, and so the lungs would collapse. And this can happen if a lung is punctured. So if you end up with a stabbing event or something like that, that can mean that the interpleural pressure is not able to be maintained. And so that's going to mean that the visceral pleura are not going to stay connected to the parietal pleura. It's going to open up. Going to end up with it's going to end up with a sucking sound, basically. It's called a pneumothorax. When a punctured lung is going to have equalized alveolar and interpleural pressure, that's called a pneumothorax, and that causes lung deflation. And sometimes we can have a punctured lung that's also going to have bleeding around it. That's called a hemopneumothorax, and that's going to actively cause the lung to deflate because we've got a ton of blood pressing against where the lung would be inflating. Okay, so when we talk about compliance, we're basically talking about how stiff the lungs are, right? And we want them to be very compliant, because the greater the compliance, the easier it is to expand. So the two determinants of lung compliance are how stretchable they are, and then the surface tension. So how much surfactant is going to be created by those alveoli 2 cells. And in order for us to exhale, we need something called recoil, and that's how basically the elasticity of the lungs to be able to push the air back out of the lungs during the forced exhalation, or really during any exhalation. So again, this is our normal breathing: in, out, in, out, in, out, in, and then a forced exhale. So this is as far low as we can go. In, out, forced inhale, in, out, forced inhale, forced exhale, in, out. All right, so the forced inhale, the forced inhale is going to be inspiratory capacity. The forced exhale is going to be the expiratory reserve volume. And the full inhale, full exhale is the vital capacity. What we normally breathe in and out, that's our tidal volume. So we're going to be utilizing these terms as we go forward. All right, so what is inside of the air? Well, nitrogen, oxygen, carbon dioxide, other things like argon and trace elements. But for our purposes, we're going to be focusing on oxygen and carbon dioxide. Well, because those are the gases that we're going to be exchanging, right? So when a liquid, again, we're going to be talking about blood here more than likely, right, is exposed to gas, including oxygen, the molecules are going to dissolve in the liquid. So when oxygen is going to come in across the alveoli, it's going to dissolve into the blood supply, okay? So as the pulmonary arteries come in, they're going to become pulmonary capillaries as they wrap around the alveoli. That's where we're going to have gas exchange occurring. So you can see they're deoxygenated here, then they become oxygenated. So our partial pressure is higher of oxygen here than it was before, right? It comes in at about 40, it leaves at about 100. Okay, so it comes in at atmospheric pressure, and then it's going to go back into the heart. It's going to get pumped into the atria, out through the ventricle, out through the aorta, and then go into systemic circulation, which is where we're going to be delivering oxygen to the cells. So we're going to travel until we hit the cells. When we hit the cells, we're going to be actually coming out of the capillaries. At this point, we're going to have oxygen lost and be picking up carbon dioxide. So you can see our oxygen is going to be dropping. Our carbon dioxide is going to be raising. And then we're going to go back through the atria, back through the ventricle, back out through the pulmonary arteries to the lungs, where we're going to have gas exchange again. All right. So if we breathe gas that has a higher concentration of oxygen, we're going to end up with more oxygen dissolved in the blood. And the opposite is also true. If we have less oxygen, we're going to have less oxygen dissolved in the blood. Why? Because we're literally going to be relying on the external environment to provide that oxygen, and we're going to be equalizing our bloodstream to the external environment. So here we're at 140, outside 140. But what came in was 40 and 46. So we've eliminated 6 of the carbon dioxide, and we picked up 60 millimeters of mercury of oxygen. So again, we're delivering the oxygen to the cells, and then we're dropping off the carbon dioxide at the lungs, we're picking up oxygen, then we're delivering it to the cells. And in order to do that, we have to go back through the heart each time. So from the body, from systemic circulation, we're going into the right side of the heart, right atrial ventricle, out to the lungs. Right? No oxygen. Coming in with oxygen because we just picked it up from the lungs, headed back to the left atria, left ventricle, back out through the aorta for systemic circulation. All right, so we can change how much oxygen and carbon dioxide we're bringing into our bloodstream by changing the rate at which we're breathing. So we can hyperventilate, which would be an increased breathing rate. And if we hyperventilate, we're going to decrease the amount of carbon dioxide in our blood. That's called hypocapnia. Now, because the concentration of carbon dioxide in our blood is directly related to the blood pH, basically, alkalosis or acidosis. So if we have a low carbon dioxide, we're going to have a high blood pH. So that's going to mean that we're going to have a basic blood, basically. And it's going to include symptoms like dizziness, weakness, lightness of feeling, lightness, tingling in your fingers and toes, and perhaps fainting. Now, we can also have hypoventilation, which is a decreased breathing rate, and that can lead to hypercapnia, which is high carbon dioxide. This is a little bit worse for you than low carbon dioxide because it can lead to respiratory acidosis or a low blood pH level. So if you know that you're going into a situation where you're going to be utilizing most of your oxygen, you might want to hyperventilate first. Like if you're going to be free diving, for example, you're going to take several really deep, very fast breaths before you are going to put yourself in a situation where you're going to have reduced oxygen for a while, right? And then eventually with reduced oxygen, you're going to end up with hypercapnia, respiratory acidosis. So again, a low blood pH is kind of acidic. And this can happen if we are drinking or taking particular drugs. So we can end up with issues that cause hypoventilation or low breathing rate. And that can be life-threatening, obviously, because oxygen is very important for our survival. Okay, so in our interstitial fluid, out here, it's going to bathe our cells, and then we also have the tissue cells. Inside the cell we have the cytoplasmic fluid, and we also are going to have the fluid that's in our blood plasma. Okay, so oxygen is going to bind on the red blood cell. It's got 4 seats for oxygen to bind called heme groups. That's why it's called hemoglobin. So each hemoglobin has 4 different seats for it to bind. And the oxygen is going to diffuse off of the red blood cell into the plasma, out of the plasma into the interstitial fluid, and then out of the interstitial fluid into the tissue cell, where it's going to be utilized to drive cellular respiration, which occurs in the mitochondria. Okay, so aerobic respiration occurs when mitochondria take pyruvate, which is half of a glucose molecule, basically, and funnel it into their Krebs cycle and electron transport chain to create ATP. So that's what happens inside the tissues. Now, in the lungs, we're going to be picking up oxygen and off-gassing our carbon dioxide. So oxygen that comes in from the atmosphere is going to go into the alveolus, going to diffuse across, and then end up in the blood plasma, and then end up picked up by the red blood cell to be delivered into systemic circulation. So this is pulmonary circulation, and this is systemic circulation, which happens in the body. This happens in the lungs, and this happens everywhere else in every cell. As I mentioned, hemoglobin is going to be the protein that binds to oxygen. It's a tetramer. That means there's 4 different protein subunits. And each protein subunit has a ferrous group that has a heme group, basically, that has iron. Remember, iron oxide is going to be rust, and that's going to make like an orange color. And so that's why our blood is going to have like an orange-red color, because hemoglobin is going to basically be iron oxide. We're going to have iron bound to oxygen and delivering that amongst the cells. Okay, here's the hemoglobin saturation curve. We're basically looking at how much of the hemoglobin is holding the oxygen and what is the partial pressure of oxygen in the system. So as we're at 0, obviously it's holding none, and when we get to 100, we should get close to 100, but we never quite do. We get to about 95. So as we have 100% systemic arterial partial pressure of oxygen, we're going to get pretty high up in our saturation and again hit 90. But what we want to look at is how it gets there. How quickly does it rise? All right, so here's our normal body temperature right here and our normal respiratory rate here in red. If, however, we can we'll see a right shift, which means that we're going to have a decrease in the rate at which it's saturated. If we have an increase in a partial pressure of carbon dioxide, which means we have a decrease in our pH, and typically we'll have an increase in our temperature as well. In order for us to see a left shift, this would be a decrease in the partial pressure of oxygen, as well as an increase in the pH, as well as a decrease in the temperature. Okay, so this is just going to basically be when we're going to see a increase in the affinity for oxygen by hemoglobin. All right, so how do we transport oxygen and carbon dioxide around? Okay, so the carbon dioxide is going to be transported mainly as a bicarbonate ion. So bicarbonate is able to basically buffer, it's a buffer system in our blood, and it's able to accept a carbon dioxide essentially. We also have it bound as carbaminohemoglobin. So some of the carbon dioxide is going to take the seats that are no longer occupied by oxygen. So oxygen is going to bind to the heme group until it goes to the cell. And then that heme group is going to be sitting empty and carbon dioxide can bind to it. And some of that carbon dioxide is going to be dissolved directly in the plasma. Now, I want to make it really clear that blood pH is not intended to vary very much. So our arterial pH might be as high as the 7.4 and venous return might be as low as 7.36. We have a really tight range that we're trying to stay within, and we do that by using the bicarbonate system as a buffer system to help maintain our blood pH. Okay, so this is basically going to be the bicarbonate system. So we have carbonic anhydrase, which is already found in the red blood cells. We also have bicarbonate, which is going to be the conversion when we're going to be picking up carbon dioxide. So when we have carbon dioxide and H2O, that's going to be able to create a bicarbonate molecule. And we can also use that bicarbonate molecule to break down to make carbonic anhydrase. And we can kind of go back and forth and back and forth. And in this way, we can accept extra carbon dioxide when we need to, and we can off-gas the carbon dioxide when we get to the lungs, right? So essentially, we can have like a little bit of a shift by what's happening with our bicarbonate. It's going to mean that we're only going to see this very small change in pH from 7.4 to 7.36, even though we see a pretty drastic amount of the change of carbon dioxide and oxygen in the system. Okay, so this is talking about our brain's control of breathing. The regulatory center for breathing is found in a region of the brain called the medulla oblongata. It also is going to be under the control of a region called the pons. So the pons is going to help to fine-tune breathing, and it's going to be responsible for smoothing that transition from inhale to exhale. The medulla oblongata has two different sets of respiratory groups. We have the dorsal respiratory group and the ventral respiratory group. These two are going to set separate sets of signals. So the dorsal respiratory group is going to signal your inspiratory muscles, so the muscles of inspiration. And it does that via innervation of the phrenic nerve through the diaphragm and external intercostals, which we just spoke about being responsible for inhalation. And then the ventral respiratory group is going to set the rhythm. How fast are we breathing? So the pacemaker cells are going to respond to things like exercise or oxygen conditions, etc. On the right here, I want to kind of show how we have kind of a feedback loop that is going to be control of breathing. We did talk about negative feedback loops previously. Anytime we're dealing with a negative feedback loop, we have some kind of stimulus that disrupts some kind of controlled condition. And when that condition is disrupted, a receptor has to detect that and send information to the integrating center, which is usually the brain. Then that brain sends information out to the effectors to do whatever the effect is. So in this case, the stimulus is going to be exercise. Okay, so you got a lot of exercise. That means that you're utilizing all of the oxygen and you're increasing the amount of carbon dioxide produced. So that means that you're going to end up with an increase of the carbon dioxide in the bloodstream and a decrease in the oxygen. So we have special receptors that detect this, right? You never know that your house is too hot or too cold unless you have the thermometer, right? So the receptors are going to detect that change. In this case, chemoreceptors are going to detect the change of the concentration of oxygen and carbon dioxide, and then send sensory information out to the region of the brain. Again, that's the medulla oblongata is the region of the brain that does this. And the medulla is going to be responsible for signaling the inspiratory muscles. Again, that's via the phrenic nerve, i.e. the diaphragm, and the external intercostals. When we signal the inspiratory muscles to increase the rate and depth of breathing, that's going to return or have the effect of returning us to homeostasis because we're going to be able to have gas exchange occur more rapidly. Hopefully that'll off-gas the carbon dioxide and bring in the oxygen more quickly. Again, regulation of breathing is going to happen because of receptors. You can't know that things are awry until the receptor tells you that something is out of regular alignment. So we have specialty receptors called stretch receptors that are in the airways to prevent overinflation of the airways. And a really nice deep inhalation, a really nice deep breath will stimulate those stretch receptors, and it's going to inhibit that dorsal respiratory group, here, which is responsible for inhalation. All right, so we also have peripheral chemoreceptors that's going to detect our concentration of oxygen and also our concentration of hydrogen ions. Remember, hydrogen ions are related to our pH. So if we end up with high hydrogen ions, that means we might have a drop in pH, so we might be suffering from acidosis of the bloodstream. We also have chemical receptors found in the medulla oblongata that are going to help us detect the concentration of carbon dioxide by detecting, again, high concentrations of hydrogen. Okay, so these are different types of breathing. These are different ways that you can breathe, basically, and the different parts of your body that are responsible for different breathing patterns. So if you're holding your breath voluntarily, your cerebral cortex is allowing you to do that. And as soon as you pass out, your cerebral cortex is going to stop you from doing that. So you cannot hold your breath until you die. You can only hold your breath until you pass out. The limbic system is responsible for the type of abnormal breathing that happens from extreme laughing, crying, or pain. So like the kind of things that are going to be abnormal breath because of extreme emotional responses. The autonomic nervous system also is in charge of breathing. So the autonomic nervous system is in charge of either rest and digest or fight and flight, right? And so it's going to be responsible for how much breathing you're going to utilize or need based on how much oxygen your system is utilizing at the time. If we end up with irritation to airway structures, we can end up with a quick reflex that inhibits breathing. We've all done this. You got to take a bite of like a funnel cake or something, and there's a bunch of powdered sugar on it. And because of that reflex where you take a breath right before you take a bite, so you can have a little bit of oxygen in your system because you're not going to be able to breathe while you're swallowing. So you're going to take a quick little breath just as you're bringing that powdered sugar up to your mouth, and you inhale it, right? It's going to have irritation to your airway structures. You're going to choke for a second, and the first thing you're going to do is inhibit your breathing. You're not going to continue to breathe. You're going to exhale, if anything, to get that out. The same thing can happen if you're in like a sandstorm or something like that. Anytime you have irritation, you're going to stop breathing for a moment to get out of whatever it is that's causing you, out of the dust cloud. Now, as we get higher in temperature, so as we get hotter, that's also going to lead to an increased rate of breathing. And medications can also change your rate of breathing, such as anesthetic, like ketamines, morphines, alcohol can inhibit your respiration, amphetamines can stimulate respiration. And another thing that's going to be tightly tied to the breathing regulation is going to be your concentrations in your blood of carbon dioxide, oxygen, and hydrogen. Because if oxygen decreases, then we're going to want to increase our rate of breathing. If carbon dioxide increases or hydrogen ions increase too high, we want to increase our rate of breathing because the objective of breathing is to bring in the oxygen and get rid of the carbon dioxide, right? Bring in the groceries and send out the trash. So if we don't have enough groceries or if we have too much trash, we need to increase how quickly we're doing this. All right, so as we exercise, we can sometimes end up with a Charlie horse or a cramp, right? And why does that happen? That happens because we've utilized all of our body's capability for aerobic respiration and we still haven't met the metabolic needs, so we're going to start using anaerobic respiration. That means that we're going to be increasing the amount of hydrogen in solution in our cells, as well as we're going to increase the lactic acid in our cells, and that can cause us a bit of pain, right? You call that a Charlie horse or a cramp in our muscles. And it should be for a short period of time until once we stop all that heavy exercise, the lactic acid will then end up being converted back into pyruvate and being utilized. Anyway, now the stimulus for this is not going to be carbon dioxide or hydrogen concentration because these are only going to be increased in venous circulation, which is the return, right? This is the return back to the heart. So they're not the primary stimulus. And again, oxygen is also only decreased in venous circulation, and it's also not the main stimulus. So the ability to increase this is going to happen based on your cardiac output. All right. So cardiac output is basically going to be how much blood your heart is able to pump in 1 minute's time. Okay, so what happens when I cough or when I sneeze? All right, these are going to be involuntary reflexes that occur when receptors in the nose or the pharynx are going to be stimulated by something. And it's going to cause a long inhalation with a forced expiration. So you're going to take a nice deep breath before you sneeze or before you cough, and then you're going to cough hard. Lots of air coming out, so your full residual volume is going to be coming out. And we also have both voluntary and involuntary control of breathing. So our involuntary control is going to take over, again, after we pass out from holding our breath, for example. But voluntary control is going to be in a different region of the brain, in the cerebral cortex, in the area called the frontal lobe. All right, so what happens if we have lung disorders? One of the classic lung disorders is called chronic obstructive pulmonary disease. And then there's a lot of different specific types of COPD, like emphysema or bronchitis, or a combination of both. Bronchitis just means inflammation of the airways. And these guys cause issues in ventilation and oxygenation of the blood. Now, emphysema happens because a lot of the smaller airway pieces have kind of collapsed. So here's a healthy alveoli, and here's alveoli with COPD. So it's damaged, and so we have larger and bigger holes in between. We don't have perfect separation, so the kind of these grapes have burst, right? And that means that we're not going to get good gas exchange here or in other places, so we might have difficulty breathing. And then chronic bronchitis has happened when we have too much mucus produced. And typically the mucus is going to obstruct the airways and cause inflammation in the airways, and thickened airways with mucus obstructing means less gas exchange, right? So we'll have less gas being able to make it in. Another disease people might suffer from if they have respiratory issues is called asthma. Asthma is going to be a disorder where we have episodes that kind of come and go, where the airway is going to contract very strongly, meaning that we have very little space for air to come through, and we're not breathing in or out anymore because we have full contractions. And so that's going to cause an increased airway resistance. So here's a bronchiole with asthma, nice and tightened down. The smooth muscles are nice and tight. They're so tight that we can't actually get air in. So it can cause problems because this individual is actually gasping for their breath but unable to perform gas exchange. And this defect occurs because of chronic inflammation of the airways. And this can vary from individual to individual as to why it happens, but it happens for many reasons, including infections, allergies, or environmental factors. So what happens is we end up with an inflammation that makes the airway, the smooth muscle, super responsive, hyper-responsive, responsive when it shouldn't be. So it's going to have really strong contractions in response to things like exercise, cold air, dry air, irritants like cigarette smoke and environmental pollutants, viruses, allergens, and a ton of other triggers. So the way that we treat asthma generally is with bronchodilation, right? A respirator or an inhaler that's going to have something in it that allows this bronchiole to open up. It's basically going to cause a smooth muscle to stop contracting. So it's going to cause relaxation and allowing us to be able to get the air back in. Another way that they can treat it is with anti-inflammatory drugs like glucocorticoids that are going to hopefully help reduce this inflammation, which is directly related to this muscle contraction. So you kind of want to target it from both ends. You want to decrease the inflammation and also get rid of that abnormal smooth muscle contraction. Okay, so here's the last slide. So this brings us to the end of our application question. And basically what you're going to do is you're going to take the percent of atmospheric oxygen, which is 16.5. So you're going to multiply 600, which is the full atmospheric pressure, by 16.5. Well, by 0.165, right? And that's going to give us 99. And yeah, your tidal volume is going to need to increase because you're going to have to inhale more oxygen to be able to get the oxygen into your blood because we have less oxygen in the air. And if the atmospheric pressure is about 600, the alveolar pressure will be the same, also 600. Now, because we have less oxygen in the air, more oxygen is going to come dissociate from the hemoglobin when it gets to the tissues, which means we're going to have lower oxygen present. That means the medulla oblongata, that region of the brain that's responsible for breathing and rhythm, is going to cause a stimulation to increase the rate of respiration. And erythropoietin is produced. What is this? Erythropoietin is a precursor to stimulate red blood cells to be created in the bone marrow. Okay, thank you so much for coming to class today, everyone. I really appreciate your time today. Thanks so much for listening, and happy studying.